and go to some slides as we finish up chapter 3. I do have a little exercise I want you to do involving your textbook. I say exercise. I just want you to write something in it. So you need to have your textbook ready or write down the page that I'm going to give you if you're just using an ebook. All right, so let's go to the slides. All right, do you see that? Yay, nay? You see that in Panama, the slide?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. That's where we ended on Monday. This chart that illustrates the powers that are expressly for the national government, reserved for the state governments, and then shared concurrently. What I want us to do today in finishing up chapter 3 and if you want to follow along, if you have the textbook pulled up or you have a paper copy, let me get mine open here. Starting on page 76, the bottom section where a new, a completely new section is beginning with national and state power over time. What we're going to look at is how federalism began in 1787, and you'll want to know all of these different types of federalism that's going to be mentioned. When federalism began, we refer to it as dual federalism, D-U-A-L, dual or two. And it's pretty equal. The duality is the national government and the states, all of the state governments. So as we begin with this slide, you can see we're going to look at basically the trajectory or the I guess the progression of dualism unto today. So if you are into notes and you like to do outlines, A, or number 1, is dual federalism. And the years are 1789 when the Constitution was, or when our first president began his first term, Washington. Now, I know this says 1865, but you need to write down, as your textbook says on page 78, and you'll see on the, in the margin, you'll see dual federalism with a little definition. Use those years, 1789 to 1937. Let's say that's point A. Point A is dual federalism, and you might put in parentheses, states are responsible for most of the fundamental governing. 1789 to 1937. Now, underneath this first point, so I'm going to go ahead and say we use the letter A. A, dual federalism. The first subpoint, number 1, is this here, an indestructible union. 1789 to 1865. What is significant about this year here, 1865? No, it's not when Mr. Bings was born. What is significant about 1865? It's the end of a war. Any guess? You can answer.
The end of the Civil War?
Yeah, the end of the Civil War. So that's why we call it an indestructible union, because even though it looked like our country was going to be torn in two, the union was saved. Now, during this, we'll just call it almost an 80-year period. Well, we'll say 75 years. This is the first half of dual federalism. During this time, the states continued to be, the state governments continued to be the primary governments that took care of the fundamental governing. But what we have during this time is we have things happening over the course of time that start to, let's just use this analogy, start to put cracks in the foundation. And they involve, 3 of the things that I'm going to mention are Supreme Court cases that I want you to know. So make sure you pay attention here. But there's another thing that's very important to understand. In 1791, so just a couple years later, Alexander Hamilton, who was in George Washington's cabinet, he wanted to establish a national bank. He felt like the Constitution gave Congress that power. Another man in George Washington's cabinet named Thomas Jefferson, you may have heard of him. Thomas Jefferson did not want a national bank. He felt like that was reading into the Constitution powers that were too broad and not clearly expressed. Jefferson wanted a government that was a smaller government, and he wanted it to be based, as far as the economy is concerned, he wanted it to be agriculturally based. Small farms and farmers being the backbone of our American economy. Hamilton wanted a strong national, he wanted a strong national presence in the economy. So he wanted a national bank, and he wanted to see businesses invested in. Well, Congress decided to charter the first bank of the United States in 1791, only upon the conditions that it would only last for 20 years. And that's what happened. So from 1791 to 1811, we had the first national bank. And in 1811, that charter expired and that bank ceased to exist. But Congress went ahead and chartered a second national bank. And this is where this first Supreme Court case comes into play. So you need to know McCulloch versus Maryland. And I'm sorry I didn't have the year on here, but just put behind it in parentheses 1819. So the Second National Bank has already been founded, and what the Second National Bank started to do was establish offices in each state. So it just wasn't located in Washington, D.C. They would have an office in the state of New York, in the state of Massachusetts. And they also had an office in the state of Maryland. Now, state banks had to pay taxes to support the national bank. And a guy by the name of McCulloch in Maryland, who had a state bank, did not want to pay taxes. Actually, I'm sorry, not pay taxes, but state banks could not tax. Actually, there wasn't any regulations about it. What McCulloch did was he taxed the national bank office in Maryland. And that bank took McCulloch to court, and eventually it made it to the Supreme Court. And this is why this case is so important. The Supreme Court said that a state entity could not tax a federal entity. So using the doctrine of the implied powers, right, not the express powers, but the powers that were basically an implication of what was in the Constitution for Congress, the Supreme Court said Congress had the power to create a national bank because it was assigned the powers to tax, borrow money, and regulate interstate commerce. And so this case is so important because it affirmed that national law is supreme to a conflicting state law. Article 6 is invoked. That's where the supremacy clause is. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Another court case that I don't have up here, but you need to take notes on. You will find it in your textbook on page 79 and 80, along with McCulloch and Maryland. is Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. Gibbons versus Ogden. The state of New York gave a man named Robert Fulton, gave him rights to operate a ferry on the Hudson River. Now, this is the state of New York. The Hudson River is a boundary between New York and New Jersey, much like the Red River is a boundary between Oklahoma and Texas. And so New York gave Fulton basically a monopoly to operate his ferry and take people back and cross the Hudson River from New York to New Jersey. Well, people in New Jersey wanted to have a ferry, and is a New York law or a New York license for Fulton, is it valid in New Jersey? And so that's what they went to court over. And the Supreme Court said that the state of New York cannot grant that license to Fulton and give him exclusive rights. This would be an interstate commerce situation. And I believe it was either Ogden or Gibbons in New Jersey. They applied for and received a federal license to ferry. And so the federal license superseded the state license. So I want you to know those two cases, because those are, again, what I said, those are like cracks in the foundation for dual federalism. Now, if you're a Star Wars fan, you know that after the first movie, A New Hope, or Star Wars, was The Empire Strikes Back. So let's think of these national cases. Well, let me back up. Let's think of these Supreme Court cases that favored national law. Let's think of them as like Star Wars. And so now let's think of the states during this time, and these things that we're going to talk about, the states strike back. All right. What happened in this 75-year period that was kind of a balance to these national cases that kept the dual federalism primarily state focused? So here's your third Supreme Court case that you need to know. And this one is not mentioned in the book, but you need to know it. The Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott was a runaway slave. He had escaped from his master and made it to a northern state, which was giving him asylum. When his master died, Dred Scott appealed for citizenship, or I'm sorry, not citizenship. He applied for, he applied for citizenship. I think it was in New York, since his master had died. He was basing this upon a piece of legislation called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. What the Supreme Court decided in 1857 was that Dred Scott was not a citizen, since slavery was still legal in the South, he was technically property of his master, and therefore he was ineligible to sue in federal courts since he was not a citizen. What the Supreme Court basically did was it struck down the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. Dred Scott was sent back to, I guess, his master's family. And what this did was this intensified the conflict and the friction between the North and the South. Another thing that happened before this, which I failed to mention, was that a guy by the name of John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, he declared that when federal laws infringe upon state laws, then the states have the power to basically say, we're not going to follow those laws from the federal government. We have the power to nullify them. The doctrine of nullification, 1832. You might jot that down in your notes. And then eventually, we're only 3 years away with the Dred Scott decision of 1857. We're only 3 years away from the beginning of the Civil War in 1860. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was still very prominent. He believed in a government of states and not a government of people. The Democratic Party had two candidates run in 1860 for president, so their party was split in half, and this enabled a new guy named Abraham Lincoln to run in a new party called the Republican Party, and with a little bit over 40% of the vote, Abraham Lincoln became president in 1860. When he was elected, South Carolina had already seceded, and actually, and by the time he took office, there were, I think there were 7 states that had seceded when he was elected. By the time he took office, there were 11 total for the South. The South seceded from the Union because of their belief in state rights. Yes, slavery was the biggest issue among many issues, but the main doctrine that the South broke away from the North was the issue of state rights. Remember, they believed that the federal government was a government of states, not a government of people. Questions? All right, we got to get into third gear here. So this slide just again illustrates the dual federalism, 1787. I said make sure you use the year 1789 to 1937, but some places are going to say it began in the 1920s. That's okay. But when dual federalism began, federal government was relatively small. And so the states did most of the governing. The federal government basically had these 3 areas: money, war, and peace. So I told you up here that dual federalism is your first big point, A. Number 1 is an indestructible union. Number two then is dual federalism and laissez-faire capitalism, 1865 to 1937. So this is sub point number 2 underneath main point A. Dual federalism and laissez-faire capitalism. Now, if you will look on page 80 of your textbook, underneath the picture, go down to the beginning of the third full paragraph where it says, no one questioned the power of the national government to regulate businesses. If you look kind of past the middle of that paragraph, it says, thus federalism, as interpreted by the Supreme Court for 70 years after the Civil War, enabled business to have its cake and to eat it too. You might put in your book, out in the margin, this is point number 2, dual federalism and laissez-faire capitalism for this 70-year period. Basically, what happened was after the Civil War, you had a lot of big businesses kind of just mushroom. You had businesses in the north go to the south. The South was devastated. The South was devastated from the war, both physically and economically, because the big cities have been destroyed. The slaves have been freed, so all the plantations were really hit hard. So people from the north came to the South and started businesses or expanded their businesses. And so during this 70-year period after the Civil War, you had the rise of big business. And several of these big businesses were able to establish monopolies. And so they were able to hike up their prices. And they were also exploiting their labor. They were taking advantage of the people that worked for them. People back then, it wasn't an 8-hour workday or 40-hour week. People back then would work 12, 14, 16 hours a day for 6 or even 7 days a week. And so, and they didn't have medical insurance. And they worked in very dangerous working conditions. So this was the rise of big business, and the federal government, which remember, according to the Commerce Clause, they are to regulate interstate business. Well, a lot of the big businesses were headquartered in a city, in a state, and all of their workers were located in that state. And so the federal government tried to regulate big business, but the Supreme Court struck it down and said it's the state's job to regulate businesses within their borders, intra-state regulation. That's one of the key differences in dual federalism. The national government regulates interstate commerce, which is trading and commerce from one state to another, interstate. But the states are to regulate intrastate commerce, I-N-T-R-A, intrastate, which means all of the business within that state is to be regulated from the state and local level. So you have these big businesses, and let's just, for example, let's say a big steel company in Pennsylvania, a big steel company is charging ridiculous prices for their steel products, and they're shipping them by railroad or by canal to other states and other nations. The federal government can only tax the shipping because that's interstate. But the federal government cannot tax or cannot try to regulate the companies, where the company is located. Let's say in Pittsburgh, the federal government cannot regulate the company within the Pennsylvania border. That has to be something that's done by the state and the local levels. So basically, this dual federalism and laissez-faire capitalism, I know I'm saying laissez wrong, but this basically means laissez-faire, that businesses should be able to run without any government interference. And this second half of dual federalism is labeled this because big businesses were basically the ones that were driving commerce policy. It wasn't the federal government, it wasn't the state. All right. However, well, actually, with that in mind, because the Supreme Court said that the federal government cannot interfere with big businesses, that was something that was on the side of the states. Another thing that was kind of in favor of the states was this Supreme Court case right here that you need to know, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Well, after the Civil War, you had the 13th Amendment, which set the slaves free. And then a few years later, you had the 14th Amendment, which basically said that no state can discriminate against any citizen, black or white or, well, not Native American, not yet. Native Americans still were kind of treated as sub-citizens. But the 14th Amendment's intent was to say that, look, African Americans have been set free and they are now citizens. And so no state can do anything that would discriminate against any citizen, black or white. Well, in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson.
I've been asked to announce that Sergeant Thurman with the U.S. Air Force National Guard will be set up in the cafetorium at lunchtime if you would like to talk to him. Thank you.
Plessy versus Ferguson. And I was fairly sure that it was in this book. What the issue was with Plessy versus Ferguson was you had Louisiana Hold on for a second, sorry. You have the Supreme Court give its famous separate but equal decision. In Louisiana, an African-American man by the name of Homer Plessy had been convicted of violating a Louisiana law. The Louisiana law, what Louisiana had done was said that when it comes to riding a train, African Americans had to be in a separate car. They could not ride in the same car as a white American. Plessy did that, and he was brought to, he was found guilty of violating that law. So it went to the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court upheld the state's right to have separate facilities for whites and facilities for blacks, as long as they were equal. That is, the facilities for the blacks would be equal to the facilities for the whites. So this was another Supreme Court case that favored the state's rights. There was only one judge who dissented in this. His name is John Marshall Harlan. And in his dissenting view, he had some pretty harsh words for his fellow judges. What this basically did was this endorsed government-based racial segregation. African-American children were forced into separate public schools that, even though the facilities might have been fairly equal, there were less teachers. Public hospitals for African Americans. They might have had the same amount of hospital rooms, but they had less doctors, they had less medical supplies. Really what happened was it became a justification for separate but unequal facilities. So all of this happened, and it continued to keep dual federalism, in which the states still had the primary obligation and function of governing. This slide kind of sums up some of the things we talked about. This slide focuses on the Supreme Court protecting businesses. Now we're out of time, so I apologize. So we'll have to pick up and go really fast on Friday with the move to cooperative federalism. Any questions though? This is why you need to make sure you read the chapters and do the outlines, because it's just so much material and it's hard for me to get through all of it. All right, if there's no questions, have a great day and a great Thursday. Looking forward to seeing you again on Friday. And I'll stay on here until you guys are done and you turn off your screens.